And then it moves into the early majority, which are the belongers, who will eventually, who come along once they see this thing is proven. They're not going to be the early adopters taking on new ideas or risk. Then it moves into the late majority, which eventually come along. And then he talks about a group called the laggards, who will never participate, the last 15%. One of the most interesting things about social change activists that I've observed is this belief system called don't preach to the choir. Because what Everett Rogers says is that you have to preach to the choir. The choir will sing loud enough to get everyone into the church or the synagogue or the mosque. If you preach to the laggards, which is where people tend to focus, you will actually undermine the innovation because the people that don't want it will start to throw cold water on it. So we have to be very smart and elegant around how we think and design our social innovations if we're going to be effective. And one of my premises, and I talk about this in my book, Social Change 2.0, is we have to actually start to be a lot smarter and more committed as change agents to learning how to do the craft of change. Because if we don't, we will keep using the same approaches that get the same results. So we have to really innovate around the whole practice of social change. I call that Social Change 2.0, which is an emerging field of second-order change or game-changing strategies. So that's the background. What I then began to do, and I didn't have those 5 principles when I began, they emerged out of the research. They were more intuitive in the beginning. So we took these principles and applied them to the area of environmental behavior change. When I started this in 1990, what we found was right around the Rio conference, and Rio confirmed this, the single greatest cause of the deterioration of the global ecosystem is the unsustainable patterns of consumption in the developing world. How we live and our production and how we produce things is the deteriorating factor of our planet. The developed world. Did I say developing? Sorry. Developed, yeah, in the developed world. So, for example, in America, we're 5% of the planet's population. We consume 25% of the resource, and we waste 75% through inefficiency and lack of awareness. That's the bad news. The good news is that 75% is the low-hanging fruit. And that's where climate change can tap. So we then began to say, okay, if that's where the action is, how do we get people to change? Knowing that 50 simple things to save the earth wasn't getting behavior change. Lists were not getting behavior change. Websites were not getting behavior change. What did you need to get people to actually change? That became the question. And we found that there were 4 reasons why people weren't changing. They didn't know where to start. They didn't know what were the important things to do. They didn't know how to do them. And they also didn't know if they did them, if it would make a difference. So why bother? I'm just a drop in the bucket. And we knew if we were going to get any results, we had to answer those 4 questions. Otherwise, we'd be wasting our time and measuring how many brochures we gave out or how many hits we had on a website, rather than whether we were actually getting measurable behavior change. So the goal, the social change design challenge, was a scalable strategy that could transform these barriers and change behavior. So our vision was to empower U.S. citizens to adopt environmentally sustainable lifestyles. No small task, certainly meets the second-order change criteria. And I wrote a book in 1990, which was called Eco Team, with support of different colleagues. Robert Gilman, in context, was one of the colleagues who helped me work with this, and others over the course of time. And what we eventually came to, and this is probably one of the more important slides of certainly what I want to contribute, was a structured program that took us 5 years to get to this level. 5 years of careful trial and error, iterative learning. And we found, so what we did is we took the overwhelm of information and we broke it into 6 areas. This is how we impact the planet: solid waste, water, energy, transportation, our purchasing practices, and how to empower others. If I do it and no one else does, it doesn't get very far. So those became the focus of the program. Then we took in each of those, we looked at what were the practices that needed to be done, and we created them into recipes. Am I bothering? Am I creating problems again? Okay, sure. Roll up my sleeve. We're getting into action here. So we created these user-friendly actions, like a recipe. Did anyone ever try to cook anything from a checklist? I wouldn't want to taste that. So the recipe was the step-by-step process, because every time someone had to go offline to a website, it was a barrier to action. So we had to help people actually take these recipes. So the book became a book of recipes, step by step. But that wasn't enough. The key part, and this is where the WeMap idea that Dan talks about came in, was we found that to get people to act, they needed each other. What we called peer support groups, or eco-teams. They created social support and social pressure to follow through and do the things that we say we're going to do. We found that without it, people would always be saying, you know, I've been meaning to do that. I bet many of you are in that category. Or, I just wish that I could find the time. People just never got it together. Knowing and doing, there was a big gap. And so we created these eco-teams, 5 to 8 households. And then the meetings were self-directed, where people could run their own meetings. We often created coaches to make sure that they were succeeding, because this was a performance-based program, actually significantly reducing our footprint. And then lastly, we started to roll this out by training people to roll this out in a city or a community. These were the results we got. We worked with 20,000 people. We had pre- and post-assessments. Everyone in the program had to actually fill this out to participate. And this was the results. We got 40% solid waste, 32% water reduction, 12% energy. It goes on. We were able to change behavior systematically. The next question, could it be sustained over time? One of the places we did this was the Netherlands. How many people are here from the Netherlands? 1, 2, 3. Oh, yes, I was trying to remember. Now I remember Jack. Hi. So we did it with the University of Leiden. We did a 2-year study. We did this program in many different countries. And what we found was, from this research study, that yes, the behavior was sustained. 2 years later, in fact, it was 22 actions were taken, 21 were sustained, and 3 new ones were added. We had 5 studies done in different cities that hired us because they wanted to see if this was working, and we found the same thing. We could change behavior, and we could sustain it over time.